He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. New Zealanders' trust in the news has been falling for years, at least 5 years in a row now to be precise, according to the most comprehensive annual survey of it that's carried out here, which is modelled on the biggest survey in the world. And we've also been leading the world, it seems, in the proportion of people who say that they turn off or turn away from the news these days and actively avoid it.
You know you want serious news. You know you should be a thinking, contributing member of society on local and social issues, but then somebody gives you a cat video.
Now, that's understandable maybe in these turbulent times, but still, if it's true, it's a real worry for our news media. But it's not just happening here, it's happening all over the world. Later in this program, we'll hear from a journalist who is striving to restore trust in local media in Canada, where they're also coming to terms with the turmoil of Trump turning on his former friends north of the border in a big way. But first, what do the fresh figures in the latest annual survey of our trust in news reveal about that and about how many of us choose to give news a swerve altogether?
Well, it's a funny old time to be doing a media show. News avoidance as high as it's ever been. And as news outlets scramble to get audiences back, we look at some of the strategies and if anything is working.
That was Medialand, a weekly show about the media for the ABC, the public broadcaster in Australia, where they're not alone, it seems, in avoiding the news and losing trust in it. But what does avoiding the news really mean? Even those who say they're turning off the so-called mainstream news media are almost certainly still reading all about the news if they're on social media. At least that's certainly what the former host of Australia's Mediawatch show, Monica Attard, reckons.
More and more people, a frightening number of people, are tuning out of institutional media. So they're not tuning into legacy media. In 2024, the proportion of Australians who didn't access news increased to 9% from 5% the year before. So that's quite a significant increase.
And on the ABC's Medialand show last week, she also insisted that the news media must not give up now on getting real journalism out, even to those who say they've given up on news media outlets in favour of social media. In fact, she said that news sources should now flood the zone with it.
The two reasons that trust is declining is that people have concern around journalism standards and they don't really trust the way journalists do the job. So the transparency issue is a really big one. We risk throwing out the journalism standards that we've come to depend on, things like impartiality and objectivity, and we've got to be able to stand by the kind of journalism that we know delivers good information, and we have to flood the zone with that good information.
Among the other things that news media have tried in order to try and keep the attention of their audiences these days is positive news, and this week the New Zealand Herald launched into that under the banner of On the Up. Hayden Donnell took a look at that in this week's Midweek Media Watch, our weekly catch-up with Nights on RNZ National. That's on our podcast page at rnz.co.nz or available in our podcast feed, which you'll find from every major podcast provider. Also on Midweek Media Watch this week, they talked about further fallout from the controversy that was sparked by the social media posts of MP Benjamin Doyle and how one of our biggest broadcasters is now owned by an Australian billboard company. Anyhow, when it comes to public attitudes to trust in the news here, the annual Trust in News in Aotearoa New Zealand report from the AUT's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy is awaited with great trepidation by our media. The sliding level of trust it's recorded in recent years has created bad news for the business, but it's also become a kind of stick for its foes to beat the media with. The alternative platform Reality Check Radio, for example, puts up billboards proclaiming that only a third of Kiwis trust the media, but for some, the survey is also validation. The Otago Daily Times, for example, has a banner on the front page every day telling its readers it is New Zealand's most trusted news brand. That's because the survey asks just over 1,000 adult New Zealanders each year which specific outlets they trust for news, as well as whether they trust the news in general. Well, the AUT's first survey back in 2020 found 53% of Kiwis trusted the news, roughly in line with the global average, but it's been all downhill since then. The survey results out today show overall trust in news has dropped again this year, but just a little, from 33% last year to 32% in 2025, the same low level, incidentally, that the Reuters Institute recorded in the United States last year. But 45% of people here say they trust the news that they choose themselves, and that's the same result as last year's survey. Still not great, obviously, but the slump, it seems, has stalled. And trust in the individual news sources that Kiwis say they use is up in almost every case. For all 17 news outlets in the survey, those who trust it outnumbered those who said they didn't. But out of all of them, RNZ was trusted by the greatest number of those who do use it, followed by the Otago Daily Times, and then TVNZ and the NBR. 69% of New Zealanders surveyed said they were interested or extremely interested in the news this year. Only 8% said they had no interest in the news at all. 34% of them said they were worn out by the news in the AUT survey, though, and while that seems a lot, a greater proportion of Germans, Brits and Americans reported being worn out by the news in 2024, and so did the Spanish and the French. But when asked if they actively avoid the news at least some of the time, 73% of those surveyed here said they do, citing negativity, their own mental health and perceptions of bias as the main reasons, and that is much higher than the Reuters Institute survey's international average last year, which was just 39%. And on top of all that, a whopping 93% of respondents here also expressed concern about poor journalism, including factual errors, clickbait and bias. And while we're at it, the survey also asked what types of news people were interested in, and followed up with focus groups. And among the findings, New Zealanders are most interested in local news and least interested in celebrity and entertainment news and so-called fun news. Interesting. The survey's coordinators are the co-directors at the AUT's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy, Dr. Greg Treadwell and Dr. Meria Mililati.
I think we didn't expect this, but we have seen an international trend from a Reuters report that internationally the trust in news has stabilized. So it was a little bit surprising, but we were really hoping that we have seen bottom of it. And of course, we don't know if we have seen, but it's stabilizing at the moment. I think news organizations are doing something right. I think they are more transparent, they're more open, they come up and tell more about their mistakes. And so I think that adds to the trust, perhaps. The other thing is, of course, that we have moved past the COVID times, and those horrendous attacks against the legacy media have kind of toned down.
And I think it's in this year that we've seen these changes. So, I mean, it appears to have stabilised, but of course we won't know till we do another report or two whether this stabilisation trend continues or not.
But do you share Meria's view, Greg, there that media might have been doing things?
Yeah, absolutely.
What could you point to that
Well, we can point to a piece in the UK Press Gazette by Stuff about Stuff saying that they were actually changing the format of their news stories to be more inclusive, less divisive, and moving away to some extent from the old traditional he said, she said kind of news, which is by some considered to be a divisive style of winners and losers journalism. So Stuff has talked about they think it would be more inclusive. We've seen it from RNZ, we've seen it from TVNZ. They really want to put trust at the heart of the operations. As a response, we do see more stories explaining how news works. I think this is critical because transparency isn't just about fessing up to your mistakes. It's about letting the audience see how news is created, and then they understand the sort of difficult decisions journalists have to make about prioritising an angle or in a busy newsroom. So I'm not saying they've never done it, but increasingly let us see a bit behind the camera. And I think that really helps.
Greg, one thing, though, about the numbers. So if we've got this overall trust in news round about a third in that bald headline figure, but the trust in individual news brands up right across the board, sometimes by double-digit percentages after people were asked to rank them. Can that possibly be right, that from big to small, they were all up with one exception where it was stable?
Yep. There's a lot of things contributing to this. As Media said earlier, the COVID pandemic and all the sort of the half-truths that were told about the media and the barefaced lies that have been told about the media since COVID, they're receding. People in their daily lives aren't as sensitized to issues like this. And I think maybe the media's also done a really good job since trust became a really prevalent issue. And we're not the only people in the world who research this, obviously. It's a trend, and it's positive. Trust is up around the world.
Remember that when the drops were big, they were also in this kind of numbers. So when the trust was dropping dramatically, we saw the double-digit numbers for the drops. So I think we're just now recovering to where they were when we started the report in 2020. Yeah, it's quite clear to us that, people go to the news sources which they see that are open and transparent, have a good standard of journalism, and then less bias.
Yeah, Greg, you mentioned that you talk specifically to the distrusters or mistrusters. The report says the negativity of news is not a major concern. This is in regard to what the news consumption of particular news brands, and whether the news outlet's values align with a person's own values was also less important. But I'm wondering, when you asked about the news avoidance, which is still high in global terms in this country, how does that square with it, that the negativity of news is not a major concern, but people are saying negative or depressing news as a reason that they might turn away from it?
I mean, there are a lot of paradoxes that are emerging as our research into trust in news deepens, and that's one of them. Negativity of news is not a major concern for trust. So it can be a negative story that people trust entirely to be accurate. But negativity it contributes strongly to the sense of the overwhelming nature of news. So people are avoiding news for its negativity. But if you ask them, do they trust a story because of, do they mistrust a story because of negativity? That's not a big issue. So news avoidance, while they're connected, news avoidance and news mistrust are two separate things.
Well, that explains actually why you also have the finding more people consume certain news brands than actually trust them. So
well,
they
exactly.
have a scepticism, but they'll kind of tolerate it, I guess. And you say this is clearly evident for big brands like Stuff, The Herald, TVNZ, and also commercial radio. But I'm interested, when I look at the charts of where you have the people that don't trust specific news brands, and they're all laid out there, you can see every single one, the percentage of people surveyed who say they just don't trust brand X or brand Y or Z is somewhere between 20 and 30% for all of them. So I'm wondering, is that a level of sort of bedrock discontent or distrust no one can shake if that's there for every single brand that you cited? I think 17 of them across the board.
Yeah, I think there is a level of unshakable mistrust, and you can see that represented, if you like, in people's political leanings, for which for the first time this year we asked our respondents who they voted for at the 2023 general election, who their party vote went to. And from that, we've extrapolated a sort of sense of whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning. It does appear from those statistics that the centre-right and the right are much more likely to mistrust the media, perceiving it as having a left-wing bias. So it's going to be a lot harder to shift those people, and that might account for the 20 or 30% in each news brand. In terms of why do more people read a brand or consume a brand than trust it, that's the nature of news. I mean, for a start, if you didn't read it, you wouldn't know whether you trusted it or not.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
And even if you mistrust a news organisation, even if you mistrust the whole media, as some people do, most people, I would say, still have a sense that they need to read it to find out what's going on and to then be able to say, I don't trust it. So there's always going to be more people consuming a brand than trust it.
Another breakdown is by age, so mistrust by age groups. And you found the most prevalent mistrust of the news was found among 55 to 64-year-olds. And then goes on to say trust is actually strongest in pure numbers terms among the younger groups, 18 to 24 and 25 to 34. I would have guessed it would have been the other way around, because surely those older groups, people 55 plus, they are the biggest users of, and I imagine subscribers to news, and yet they're the ones that mistrust the news the most.
It is perhaps surprising, but on the other hand, when Greg was conducting those focus groups and when we were talking to that age group, and a lot of them say that they really wanted more, for example, international news. A lot of them say that they go to the Aotearoa or New York Times or Guardian or whatever. They feel that something is missing. Of course, they are older I can't say that they're wiser, but they have more experience about the media. So I think
and I think also older people feel the media ain't what it used to be.
Right.
And young people don't know what it used to be. You know, older people, and this was a focus group of 55 to 64-year-olds, so not the oldest age groups, but people who felt that the world had been changed beyond recognition for them. And I think their response was to reject the way New Zealand media organisations portrayed the world. And there's no doubt from that focus group that there was a very strong rejection of New Zealand media and a sort of nostalgic reach for, quote, quality journalism, unquote. Of course, the world media is in crisis. It's not just New Zealand. But I think that sort of helps explain it. And as for the younger people trusting it, one of the things that we're coming to understand is that news on social media loses its identity. I think young people, whether they trust wider content on social media or not, they don't necessarily distinguish between other content and news. If it's all found on Facebook, it's Facebook. And they do trust Facebook, or at least they don't have the same sense of fear of Facebook that the older generations do, and its sort of, ability to carry disinformation and stuff like that. So I think younger people don't distinguish so much, and they just see that information on Facebook. Well, I don't trust anything. Why would Facebook be worse than anything else? It's all just information on the internet.
Yeah, and the more people are using social platforms for news, your survey picked that up. I think it was a 3% jump from last year. But are they doing this, you think, in addition to also some level of traditional media sources, or are these mostly people perhaps who are just going first and foremost to social?
It's kind of no-brainer that, the age groups from 18 to 35, news, it is YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and then older ones are in the traditional media. But it's not saying that, younger people wouldn't actually use the news.
Well, news avoidance, this is still way, way higher than the global average in the Reuters Institute news report. So why are people prepared to answer that question that way, that they avoid the news at least some of the time? And yet your other findings show the decline of trust has stabilised and people are prepared to record higher trust scores for those individual news brands.
And we had about 1/3 of New Zealanders saying that they are worn out about the amount of the news. This year, what we find out that, a lot of people were wary about the news of Trump. And because Trump is dominating our news cycle at the moment, so many people are overwhelmed by the Trump news, and hence they're also avoiding the news.
There's a wonderful paradox going on here, and this is why the research every year is getting more complex, because as we look and ask new questions and compare data sets of answers with each other, we do find these paradoxes, and you've pointed out a really good one. But there is a theory that New Zealanders are amongst the highest in the world in terms of interest in news.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
So if you just kind of imagine these three things colliding, a really high interest in news, a really strong sense of being overwhelmed by it, and really, low levels of trust in news, we have New Zealanders who really want to be informed but feel overwhelmed when they are and start avoiding it. And then they go back to it and then they start avoiding it. Because, of course, when we ask people about news avoidance, we're not asking, do you never turn the news on? We're saying, do you find yourself actively avoiding the news to some extent? And a lot of us do that. And particularly, as Media says, Trump fatigue is one of our strongest findings around news avoidance this year. It's not the highest reason for avoiding the news, but it's the new one.
So you can avoid the news sometimes when you do turn it on. A substantial number say, it's wearing me out.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm still really interested in it.
That's right. And so New Zealanders are in this terrible position where they're instinctively drawn to the news only to find it repulsive, or repelling is a better word. And I think it's pretty intuitive for people, the idea of Trump fatigue.
Yeah.
Trump fatigue is real, and it's also not just in New Zealand. So Trump fatigue really is the new kid on the block in terms of reasons to avoid news.
You mentioned earlier, both of you saying the media seem to be doing things that have prompted people to say, when asked about specific brands, yep, I trust it, yep, and that's going up. The Herald this week, last week in fact, launched this brand, if you can call it that, called On the Up. More positive, uplifting type of stories. It's a clear editorial strategy. Do you think that will work?
No. I applaud it, and I think the Herald's grasped this issue between the teeth in some ways. But just in general, not particularly about the Herald's campaign, but in general, positive news is actually very low on people's list of desires. So this year we asked people, what types of news are you most interested in? At the very top, at 72% of people are interested in local news, 70% of people in international news, 62%, believe it or not, in political news. And then it goes through some sort of areas of journalism that you'll recognise: crime and security, science and technology, environment, etc. Right down the bottom at 26%, what we called fun news.
I know.
21% entertainment and celebrity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a little bit hard to talk about positive news and negative news because...
But I still find that weird because people do like fun stuff. I mean, not for nothing did
but
the
it's
New York
been a
Times
very-
by Wordle and,
Yeah, but
papers
it's
over
not- is that
COVID doubled
news?
their puzzles
We're-
and all this. I know it's not news, but it means people engaging with the media do like fun. And I just wonder
No,
with
they
that
do.
question, like when you're presented with this list of what are your habits, you don't want to admit, I love the celebrity
Well,
stuff.
we know
Of
that
course I
we-
read the international news. But that again, doesn't this illustrate maybe that when you ask about trust, it can be difficult? It encourages people to think about what they distrust or question it. If you ask about what they value, it'll be different.
Absolutely. Look, it's a very old story in journalism, and that people ask for serious international news, but their preference is actually for trivia. But that sort of stuff is the difference between economic theory and behavioural economics. What people say should happen and what they actually do are quite different things. And we've known that a long time in journalism, that people demand high-quality news but are drawn to less serious stuff. And look, you go into a shop and you know you're going for vegetables and you walk out with sweets and sugar. It's the same thing, right? It's attractive. It's addictive. This is clickbait. It's hard to avoid. And you know you want serious news. You know you should be a thinking, contributing member of society on local and social issues, but then somebody gives you a cat video. And we've always been very clear about that this is self-reported trust levels. This is not some scientific, psychological experiment to see if what they say is really what they think. We just can ask them what they believe.
When you said about the value, if you ask about the value and if you ask about trust, of course, they are kind of different things. But at this point of the history, when we have journalism is attacked in all sorts of ways, the trust is the one with super important for journalism, because if you don't have a trust, then you don't have a job, Colin.
With that in mind, I mean, do you yourselves worry perhaps about how your survey results might be used? For example, alternative platform Reality Check Radio, hostile to mainstream media. I think it's fair to say they have billboards
More than
up.
fair to say.
Yeah, saying a third of Kiwis trust the media, and I'm guessing that the survey would be the source of that.
It is, yeah.
The Otago Daily Times, just to flip it around, they have had a front page banner all year proclaiming it the most trusted brand. They're very pleased to have come top in the 2024 survey by a small margin when people are ranking it 1 to 10 and the mean score is taken. Are you happy with the way it's being used?
Look, Colin, we can't control how the report and the results are used. We are doing this research independently. We are not thinking about, how they look in this trust survey or, how they're using the brand. We just want to get the information out and measure it properly and, with a proper methodology. Both on the right and on the left, they use it for their own purposes. And what comes to the Otago Daily Times banner, we have seen it, but now they have to take it down.
Yeah. I mean, when news organisations win awards, they leave it on their front page for 3 or 4 years, Best Community Newspaper 2017. And I completely understand why the ODT's done that, and I think it's great because I think it's part of building the relationship with their audience. You need context to understand what these statistics actually signify. And of course, there's a Reality Check Radio's billboards don't provide context, and they're probably pretty happy they don't.
But they can have a real impact, though, can't they? Because, for example, when RNZ did its statement of performance expectations, it has to do every year for the current year, the Media and Communications Minister, Paul Goldsmith, responded in writing and said he expected RNZ to continue to focus on preserving and enhancing trust metrics. This outcome of your survey will be noted, at the top levels of government where decisions are made.
But the government can read the whole thing and not just use the bullet points. I mean, great. The very first trust report we ever wrote was used in Parliament ahead of the development of the, now we understand to be controversial, Public Interest Journalism Fund. So we really want our report to influence policy, absolutely.
Institutions like RNZ are doing their own trust surveys as well. And whether this is influencing the policy or whatever for the individual news brands, we don't know how the report is used. We can't stop the politicians using it.
The Reuters Institute survey, I think, began asking about AI internationally last year. So it's interesting, I think the results mirror the international one. 60% of people expressing discomfort with using AI in news. Only 8% really comfortable with news being produced mostly by AI with some human oversight. That is low. Do those responses surprise you at all?
No. It follows the international trend. And I think, the key point here is that, there's a really low level of the people trusting the AI-produced news. The news organizations have to make sure that they are as transparent as they can and open about the all use of the AI. I think it's a paramount, and if you don't do it properly, the trust, you're gonna erode your trust.
Seems to me AI doesn't really have a gut feeling around social justice, and journalists do. It will never replace the work of a journalist at the moment when they have a gut feeling something's wrong. And that's when a journalist starts following a story. And I think there's not much wrong with using AI to gather your evidence, but you've really got to double-check everything AI tells you, because it's more than capable of mistakes. In fact, we know it has made huge blunders. So I'm not at all surprised that the public mistrusts news with AI. They actually want to hold journalists accountable for the news, not some vague, mysterious program.
Is disclosure important here? Because, we know last year the New Zealand Herald was revealed to have used it in editorials that wasn't clear to readers. They couldn't have known. Stuff had a policy of declaring every use. At that time, they quietly rewrote that just back in February to say that they won't point it out every time as they previously said they would, because they didn't really, I think they feel it's not entirely practical. Does that matter? Or will people just get used to it?
Yes. And I don't know if this is a common knowledge, but that the Herald's, the whole homepage is organized by the AI bot. Maybe it's not surprising but for me, I haven't seen it anywhere stated. You should tell that.
Yeah, and one of the issues, but even if you tell them it's happening, you have to explain to readers how it works. So is AI just counting the clicks, and so the more clicks it gets, the higher it stays for the longer on the front homepage? Now that's a well-known thing in digital journalism, that the number of people who click on a story does impact how long it stays on. Is that going to be 100% of the reasons for choosing what leads the homepage? Or, in fact, is there going to be a journalist who understands society from all, or at least a reasonably wide perspective, so that they can say, look, people might not be clicking so much on this, but this is a massively important story because it's about our founding treaty document, for example, or it's an issue about women's safety, but, men aren't clicking on it, so we won't have it at the top. Or is there, or in fact, is it a mix of reading the metrics and making sound journalistic judgments? Because if we promote news simply because it's being clicked on, then we're back in clickbait days.
Yeah.
And just to return finally to almost where we began, those startling jumps, those leaps in recorded public trust when people were asked to rank individual outlets from 1 to 10, scores averaged out, really big increases right across the board. So you believe it's partly a less sour mood among the public in general this year as opposed to last year or before, but you're convinced that there are things the media have done in response to public concern about trust and reputation, and that the people have noticed it, and that has influenced their scores.
Yes, I'm confident with that. I really believe in that some things are moving on the right direction.
The individual brand jumps could be in part down to the fact that there appears clearly to be much less strategized attacks on the credibility of the mainstream media. So if you're asked, do you trust the New Zealand Herald, but yesterday somebody told you that, it was in the pocket of Jacinda's government, that influence is fading. And so people are less influenced by the naysayers, the pure disinformation agents around media, far fewer opportunities to hear people running the Herald down.
The idea that the news media is in the government's pocket is also going away. So in the comment sections, we hardly see any commenting on the. Yep. So that's also going. That perception that government is buying the news media is going away.
How do you know that for sure, though?
The answers to our open-ended questions. So how do you feel? Why questions? What we can see from those is proportion. The proportion of comments around the Public Interest Journalism Fund was tiny compared to just last year. But there's no doubt in our minds that the sort of terribly suspicious mood that emerged out of that time is fading.
It's very clear.
There was Dr. Meria Mililati and Dr. Greg Treadwell, the authors of the latest and just released annual Trust in News in Aotearoa New Zealand report, and that's published by the Auckland University of Technology's Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy. And you can find a link to the full report that we talked about there in the online version of the story. That's on the Mediawatch page at rnz.co.nz or in the show notes for the podcast of this episode. Well, as we've just heard, declining trust in the media and more people avoiding the news altogether is a problem in many places around the world, among them Canada. And there have been many closures of local news outlets following another wave of them in the chaos caused by COVID-19. Now, in the wake of all that, a grassroots group called Ink-Stained Wretches was formed to help save outlets under threat, along with the loftier goal of building a culture of appreciation for quality journalism in Canada. Mirko Petrashevich formed the group after almost 3 decades at his local paper near Toronto, the Waterloo Region Record, and he told me they have similar scepticism among the public there.
I can't say what it's been over the last 5 years, but I know in the last year there was a drop into about 39%. And this is according to the Reuters digital news report. The overall trust rating is 39% in media. However, if you drill down into the numbers and you're looking at regional media, that trust level jumps to 61 to 65%. And when you're looking at certain regions, let's say Quebec, their trust in Radio Canada, the French language public service, you're getting up over 70, 75. We have pressure groups, sort of right of center think tanks that will sort of play up levels of trust or distrust in the media as a way, I think, to discredit the news media. And it's interesting
or even to say they're not worthy of state
funding.
Support. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But again, the surveys are continually showing that Canadians are more trustful in their local media and their public broadcaster. There's a high level of trust in their public broadcaster. The opposition party in Canada that's now campaigning on defunding the public broadcaster by $1 billion a year. The CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, like any media organization, is a big target. Not everybody's going to be pleased with it.
So when I was reading about the problems facing local news, came across a recently published comment. David MacDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, he says nearly 2.5 million Canadians now live on a postal code with only one or no local news outlet. Suburban cities outside Vancouver, Toronto and Montreal have been hit particularly hard. Their residents may get coverage from major nearby centres, which is, I guess, the case where you live, but there's little journalism focused on local councils, events and businesses. Is that a Canada-wide problem?
Yes. Yeah, in Canada, since the big Great Recession of 2008, 2009, Canada's lost probably 525 or more news outlets. They've either closed or merged. The ones that have survived are greatly diminished. And there are a few successful startups, very good, doing some great work. But I think it pales in comparison to what has been lost. So that capacity to serve the community is not there the way it was 10, 15 years ago.
Now, you yourself, having done 27 years at the paper.
Yep.
Extraordinary. You get less for murder, as the joke goes.
I was a lifer, but I got out. Yeah.
Not a life sentence. Oh, that's jolly good. But you are now engaged in trying to rebuild trust, or trying to, and as it's been described, build a culture of appreciation for quality journalism.
Yeah.
And also part of this is to urge local politicians to actually come out and publicly support the media. Are they receptive to that?
Well, they're more receptive than I thought. We're a grassroots advocacy group. And so what started out as a small regional campaign. Within 2 years, we had 29 municipalities across Canada, from one side to the other, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, St. John's, pass motions expressing support for professional journalism. And so that 29 municipalities, that was home to about more than 11 million residents in Canada.
Expressing support, though, is one thing. I mean, a politician can say that in response to pressure. Is there anything you could point to, whether it's your group or not, that shows that politicians actually have acted on it?
Sure, not on, I can't say it's something that we can take credit for, but at the federal level, there has been a number of tax incentives, tax breaks, and support for a local journalism initiative that hires or maintains about 400 journalists across the country in about 1,500 communities.
Is that paid for from some public funding source?
Either there's a public funding source or there's a tax break or something like that.
To employ the reporters?
Yeah. And those reporters are in underserviced areas. And just last year, the provincial government basically directed their agencies to dedicate a minimum 25% of their advertising spend on Ontario-based publishers, which is amazing because we're talking about the Lottery Corporation, we're talking about the Liquor Control Board, which is one of the largest purchasers of alcohol in the world. And so that isn't costing the public any more money. It's just shifting it to Ontario-based publishers and hopefully from foreign online platforms, I'm hoping. People need to appreciate that, okay, what's the media's role here? Anybody who's running news outlets, what's the business model? How can we survive to the next quarter or the next year or whatever? We're taking a longer term approach. We feel that if we can create a culture of appreciation, then people will support it, whether through subscriptions or public funding. So it's a slow, long project that we're involved in.
Ink-Stained Wretches. It's a catchy name and very cool ink blot logo that you have here on your merch.
Thank you.
But it's a little bit of a retro kind of name. As Ink-Stained Wretches does conjure up legacy newsprint, newspaper, old school media. Yeah. Presumably that's not really what you want.
Yeah, but anybody, it's kind of cool to be called a wretch, is it not?
I'd be happy with it.
There we go. It kind of appeals to maybe an older crowd. But we're not looking back at some golden age of, where things were all great. We knew that. We know that things. No, we're looking at incorporating anybody who cares about democracy and sees that journalism is a way that makes a healthy democracy possible.
So you want people who care about all that to sign up. And what do you want them to do for you?
Our main campaign is to raise awareness for World Press Freedom Day, May 3rd. Every year. And I worked my whole career as a journalist and didn't know that World Press Freedom Day existed. To recognize World Press Freedom Day in a number of ways, whether the municipality or the mayor issues proclamations, which is fairly common. Many will maybe light City Hall. Last year we had 35. This year, so far, we have a couple in Australia, in Perth, and on the Gold Coast. And we have our first this year on continental Europe, in Geneva, in Switzerland. But in Canada last year, let's say we had Niagara Falls lit for World Press Freedom Day, the CN Tower, World Press Freedom Day, and about 24 municipalities recognize World Press Freedom Day in some way or other.
And do you also want people where they are to do that lobbying of local officials to make sure if their local news outlet is under threat to get them to commit?
Yeah, 100%. And we've also compiled a toolkit of what municipal leaders can do to support local journalism.
Interesting quote from you here. You say, look, even if newsrooms beat back the existential threat posed by new technology and the changing business model, the reprieve will only likely last until the next disruptor cannonballs into the press pool. So are you thinking really, even if you solve this problem of like, what do we do about the business model because advertising is not reliable anymore, you've got to think beyond that, you think?
Yeah, and I think there are enough people focused on that immediate threat. And when so many people are focused on the business model, focused on AI, focused on the next surviving to the next quarter and the next year, quality journalism is a community resource. It's not just something that like a widget that you can import from overseas, right?
Now, I know you've been on the road for, I think, better part of 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And when you left Canada, I'm guessing yourselves in the United States would have been described as friendly countries. So much has happened in the last 6 weeks.
It has.
I would not blame you for not wanting to check on news back home, but I wonder how you feel for journalists working in Canada now that they have to report on this extraordinary breakdown in relationships between the two countries.
Well, it is sad because, I mean, we do have a lot of relations with people in the States. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Unfortunately, a lot of people are going to get hurt economically.
A lot of commentary, Trump's torn it up, 100 years of trade and economic race, he's ripped it apart, it can never be restored. On the other hand, if you've been in journalism a while and looking at national affairs, do you think, well, this presidency will come to an end? Maybe now's not the time to panic. And if we look back on it in 10 years' time, it'll be certainly a moment in history, but might not be some sort of massive epochal eruption that changed everything. And life might be a bit more like it was before he came in the White House a second time?
There's going to be a lot more disruption in my mind before we get there. And I think we need to be clear-eyed about the possibilities of the fallout of these things. I mean, when there's chaos, too, you can't predict where it'll take you. Rekindling friendships among our maybe Commonwealth partners is one way to do it. That's why I'm here calling.
You're the advance guard on
Yes,
a diplomatic mission, for sure.
Hands across the water.
But have you noticed, I mean, if you must be reading commentaries and things in Canadian press, is there a kind of patriotic urge or something that's coming at a militant tone? Or, I mean, Canada has this reputation as a mild and polite nation. I mean, I know it's all stereotypes and so on.
Well, you talked about news avoidance, right?
Yeah.
So I'm avoiding it a little bit.
But it would be a challenge for editors if their citizens are mad, angry, upset.
I've seen both. I've seen both headlines. I've seen like "Don't panic," and I've seen the sky's falling kind of. But I mean, sure, that feeds into Canadians' sense of self-identity, and we're a quiet nation, but also we play hockey. We can play it fairly rough. We take care of ourselves.
That's Mirko Petrushevich, who founded the Canadian media advocacy group Ink-Stained Wretches after almost 3 decades spent at his local paper near Toronto, the Waterloo Region Record. And finally this week, Thursday was quite a morning for morning news shows here. As dawn broke, news broke on Trump's social media feed that tariffs would be paused, but also ramped up on China. And while the media were understandably focused on that, another development in the US went a bit more under the media's radar, even though it's something that directly affected the way that they themselves report on Trump's White House, and indeed from it. On the Mike Hosking breakfast on News Talk ZB, though, the host was onto it.
White House cannot bar Associated Press reporters. This is AP from the White House, from Air Force One, from other secure spaces. District Court Judge Trevor McFadden, appointed interestingly by Trump, contrary to the First Amendment, stayed the order requiring the White House to restore access from taking effect until Sunday to give the White House time to appeal, which of course they will. If you've forgotten the story, AP refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, so Trump banned them. It does not bestow special treatment upon AP, says the judge. The court simply holds that under the First Amendment, if the government opens its doors to some journalists, be it the Oval Office, the East Room or elsewhere, it cannot then shut those doors to other journalists because of their viewpoints. The Constitution requires no less.
Remember when we thought that was the dumbest thing that Trump had done?
Those were the days, eh?
But even though the US Constitution demands it, according to the court can't stop the Trump White House from appealing that ruling to keep the AP out. AP's executive editor, Julie Pace, responded like this.
We pursued every possible avenue before taking legal action. But we must stand on principle for the Associated Press, for our thousands of customers and their audiences, and for every news organization and every person in the United States. The AP has no corporate owner and no shareholders. We are independent, beholden to the facts and the public's right to know. If we don't step up to defend the right of Americans to speak freely, who will?
Well, not the Trump White House, it seems clear. Whether the courts can get the AP back through the White House door remains to be seen. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. And if you have any thoughts to share or ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything you think we should know about, do get in touch in the meantime. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz. You'll also find us at Mediawatch NZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.